pathways in an effort to understand how they work. And so hormone literally means to excite, and so these are molecules that elicit certain responses by binding to receptors either on our cells or within our cells. And remember that hormones are used in long-distance signaling primarily. And so there's different parts of our endocrine system. There's a bunch of different glands shown here, and what they do is they secrete these hormones into our bloodstream, and then they're able to target cells with the appropriate receptors near or far away. So we're going to look at two different classes of hormones. The first type we're going to look at are called steroid or lipid hormones. And so recall that lipids are hydrophobic, which means that they do not like water. And so since the cell membrane itself is primarily hydrophobic and like dissolves like, that means that the steroid hormones are going to actually be able to diffuse right through the cell membrane, and so they're going to bind on intracellular receptors, which are receptor proteins found inside the cytoplasm of the cell. So shown here, we can see a steroid hormone binding to this receptor, and then together they form a complex called a transcription factor here. And recall that transcription factors can alter the transcription of mRNA and then ultimately produce a particular protein. And so that's how these types of hormones are primarily going to act upon a cell. So we're going to watch a short little video clip here so you can see this in action.
Steroid hormones are not water-soluble. They travel in the blood attached to protein carriers. When steroid hormones arrive at their target cells, they dissociate from their protein carriers and pass through the plasma membrane of the cell. Some steroid hormones bind to specific receptor proteins in the cytoplasm and then move as a hormone receptor complex into the nucleus. Other steroids travel directly into the nucleus before encountering their receptor proteins, not shown. The hormone receptor protein, activated by binding to the hormone, is now able to bind to specific regions of the DNA. These DNA regions are known as the hormone response elements. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at that site. Messenger RNA, mRNA, is produced, which then codes for the synthesis of specific proteins.
Alright, so next we're going to look at the second type of hormones, which are protein hormones. And so these are hydrophilic, which means that they like water, but that also means that they cannot travel through the cell membrane. So because of that, they have to bind to proteins on the surface of the cell membrane, and that's where their receptors are. And so these types of hormones are going to act very similarly just to how we learned with the signal transduction pathway. So bind to a receptor on the surface and then cause some type of transduction where we have maybe change in shape of different proteins or enzymes doing different things, and then ultimately we have some type of cellular response. So we'll look at an example that we're familiar with, which is how epinephrine, which happens to be a protein hormone, how that acts upon a liver cell.
Epinephrine is one of many hormones that is water-soluble, hydrophilic, and therefore unable to cross the hydrophobic plasma membranes of its target cells. Instead, it binds to receptor proteins located in the plasma membrane and does not enter the cell. When epinephrine binds to beta-adrenergic receptors on the liver cell, G proteins on the inner side of the cell membrane are activated. Each G protein is composed of 3 subunits, and the binding of epinephrine to its receptor protein causes one of the G protein subunits to dissociate from the other 2. The G protein subunit which dissociates from the others carries a GDP, which is replaced by GTP when the subunit is activated. The activated G protein subunit then diffuses within the plasma membrane until it encounters adenylyl cyclase, a membrane enzyme that is inactive until it interacts with the G protein subunit. When activated by the G protein subunit, adenylyl cyclase catalyzes the formation of CAMP from ATP. The CAMP formed at the inner surface of the membrane diffuses within the cytoplasm, where it binds to and activates protein kinase A, an enzyme that adds phosphate groups to specific cellular proteins. In liver cells, protein kinase A phosphorylates and thereby activates another enzyme called phosphorylase, which converts glycogen into glucose 6-phosphate. The glucose 6-phosphate is then converted to glucose. Through this multi-step mechanism, epinephrine causes the liver to secrete glucose into the blood during the fight or flight reaction.
Alright, so the last thing I want to touch on here is what can happen if you don't have receptor proteins that function properly. So it doesn't matter if you make the particular hormone as much as it also matters that you have the receptor to actually respond to it. And so androgen insensitivity syndrome results when people don't make the proper receptors that can bind to the hormones that their body secretes. So this particular syndrome affects males. But what happens is they can't respond to certain male sex hormones, and so they don't make those secondary male sex characteristics. So there are varying levels of severity of this syndrome, but in the most severe levels, what happens is individuals are born and externally they actually look female, and so when they're born, they may be mistaken for being a female and ultimately can be brought up as a female if the parents would not have any type of blood test or anything else to indicate that they are male. So a lot of times in the most severe cases, individuals don't find out that they are actually male until they fail to get their menstrual cycle, or in some cases even until they try to have children and realize that they can't because internally they don't have a uterus, they don't have ovaries, but instead internally they have male reproductive parts. So it can be an extremely devastating syndrome in the most extreme cases especially, but this is an example of just how important it is not just to make a particular hormone, but that your body has the ability to respond to it.